Well, this year, ladies and gentlemen, we have as our president one of the most distinguished academics on the teaching of Scottish literature in this country today, Professor Gerard Carruthers. Professor Carruthers holds the Francis Hutcheson Chair of Scottish Literature at the University of Glasgow, where he works on literature from the 1690s to the 20th century, with particular interest in the 18th century in Scotland, textual editing and book history. He's done wide-ranging work on Robert Burns, but most relevant to us is that he's Glasgow University's representative on the Joint Abbotsford Advisory Committee guiding research into the library of Sir Walter Scott. There have often been comparisons drawn between Burns and Scott as song collectors and preservers of the old oral tradition in Scotland, and I can think of nobody who's better fitted to speak to us tonight on our great collector, Sir Walter Scott, than Professor Gerry Carruthers.
Chairman Bailey, ladies and gentlemen of the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club, thank you very much for the honorary presidency. One of the many excellent things done for us by the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels, begun in the 1990s and now complete, is clean and restore, remove the grime from a masterpiece. Walter Scott's Chronicles of the Canongate, first published in 1827. Claire Lamont's excellent EEWN edition of Scott's text brings back to life a book about new life, although paradoxically it is also a book about the difficulty of life and indeed about death. The narrator of Chronicles of the Canongate is Crystal Croft-Angry, an elderly man recently returned to Scotland, where he had many years before wasted the family patrimony and been put into debtor's prison. Abroad, he has remade his fortune and has returned to his native land, intent on repurchasing the estate that he had lost in Lanarkshire. However, he changes his mind and decides instead to settle in Holyrood, in a house he names Little Croft-Angry, away from both the new town and the old of Edinburgh, or what he calls the two extremities of the moral world at my threshold. What is being referred to in the received perception are new town morality and old town immorality. But Croft-Angry knows that things are more complicated than this, that things are not always so black and white. Surprisingly for the reader, Croft-Angry enjoys his proximity to Holyrood and the King's Park, traditional sanctuary for debtors. The location serves as a reminder to Croft-Angry of the past, not in a painful but in a salutary fashion. It helps him remember that things are not guaranteed in life, that shares can go down as well as up, and he's not in retirement going to rest smugly on his restored status in comfortable means. He's done with upward mobility and rests content at the bottom of the Royal Mile, where once, historically, great responsibility was wielded, but no longer. Croft-Angry also savours from his retired location the sight of Arthur's Seat, which seems to stand for him as something beyond human organisation, beyond the metropolis, new town or old. In the 20th century, another Edinburgh writer, Muriel Sparks, steeped in Scott, and also Robert Louis Stevenson, observed Scotland's capital with the jagged bits sticking through, Arthur's Seat, the Castle Rock, and formed her nevertheless principle. There is civilization, but nevertheless there is something else. We'll come back to that something else with regard to Walter Scott. Chronicles of the Canongate, narrated by Crystal Croft-Angry, is at once an old man's book. It's tender, elegiac, wise, and it's also at the same time one of the freshest things that Scott ever produced. There's a particular autobiographical background for Scott as well as Croft-Angry. As many of you will be aware, this period, the later 1820s, was Scott's most challenging time. At the beginning of 1826, Scott had become insolvent in the wake of his publisher Archibald Constable and his printer James Ballantyne having borrowed too much, and a simultaneous collapse of financial credit. These things meant that banks would no longer underwrite further loans to the Scott cottage industry, and it suddenly collapsed. By this time in 1826, Scott had had nearly a decade of his first editions, of 14 different works in that period in fact, being produced in 10,000 copies for a first edition, quickly selling out and going into subsequent editions, and up usually to at least a fourth or fifth edition. And these volumes in hardback were each going for about 70 quid a unit in today's terms. So we're talking about the upper end of quality book production in the first part of the 19th century. Anyway, Scott was left liable for debts for all the partners, and also for a mortgage on his home at Abbotsford, amounting in total to £126,000, or well over £8 million in today's terms. As a result, Scott had to sell his home in Castle Street here in Edinburgh, and also in the first part of 1826, in May, he suffers the death of his wife Charlotte. But our writer very nobly decides to wipe out as much of the debt as possible with new writing, new publications. He succeeded quickly to repay large sums, so that in 1830 Abbotsford was returned to Scott from the hands of his creditors, and the principal debt was more or less fully repaid by 1833, sadly the year after Scott's death. This is the background: ruin, anxiety, uncertainty, against which Chronicles of the Canongate was written. As an index of Scott's moods, it is astonishing. There is a note of contrition over being ruined. As a simulacrum to this, Croftangry laments his years of profligacy. Scott, of course, did not come to grief in that exact fashion, but Croftangry's thoughtlessness refracts Scott's regret that he's perhaps not been a bit more cautious in his business dealings. But much more striking in terms of mood is the creative buoyancy, the fresh life, which is registered in the Chronicles of the Canongate. Scott's avatar, or alter ego, Croftangry, has decided, albeit in his sunset years, to become a writer. For a moment, the modern reader might think of Homer Simpson turning to his wife, as he does on occasion at the end of an episode of that cartoon where all has gone badly wrong, saying, "Marge, I've learned nothing at all." Chronicles of the Canongate is also the first publication that explicitly acknowledges the open secret of Scott as the authorly of Waverley et al. The pretence of his anonymity could not be sustained any longer after his many creditors met in January 1826. And in Scott's introduction to the Chronicles, he ruefully, humorously casts off his mask. He tells the story of a great Italian actor who his admirers thought had one fault, that he appears as a harlequin. They persuade him that his delicate vein of humour, his happy turn for dialogue, were rendered burlesque and ludicrous by this unmeaning and bizarre disguise. So the harlequin is persuaded to play his roles straight in future. He played the harlequin barefaced, but was considered on all hands as having made a total failure. He had lost the audacity which a sense of incognito bestowed, and with it all the reckless play of raillery which gave vivacity to his original acting. He cursed his advisers and resumed his grotesque grizzard, but it is said without ever being able to regain the careless and successful levity which the consciousness of the disguise had formerly bestowed. Scott will not be had in the same way. His introduction to a work of fiction, the Chronicles, might be signed Walter Scott for the first time, but the harlequin's mask is immediately pulled back on. He will be Crystal Croftangry, introducing a series of 3 long short stories. These stories, The Two Drovers, The Highland Widow and The Surgeon's Daughter, are excellent in and of themselves, so that it's not surprising that they've been excerpted for anthologies of the Scottish short story, or divided across separating volumes in later editions of Scott's work through the later 19th and into the 20th century. But actually the stories and Croft Angry's chapters belong all together. Long prefatory and interconnecting chapters by our narrator and the three stories connect to form an extended meditation on art and life. Claire Lamont's edition is the first properly edited version to remove a number of mistakes in the plot, especially in the case of the surgeon's daughter. Why were these mistakes allowed to pass from Scott's own proofs, effectively, down to the 21st century? Well, Scott is certainly intensely engaged in the composition of Chronicles of the Canongate, but its production was drawn out from spring 1826 to the summer of 1827, a long period on one work of fiction by Scott's standards. And this was the case principally because he was also busy finishing his 9-volume Life of Napoleon for publication in 1827, which he had good cause to hope would recoup a large income towards chipping away at his debts. One of the things that Chronicles of the Canongate is about is transience. Crystal Croft Angry tells us scenes in which our ancestors thought deeply, acted fiercely, and died desperately are to us tales to divert the tedium of a winter's evening. So everything in time becomes story. What was principled stand, the horrific event, the financial scandal even, becomes entertainment eventually. Stories, though, are not just recreational. They are our way of making sense of the world, the mechanism of our cultural currency, whether fictional, the historical novel say, or non-fictional, a newspaper report. Stories are our way of summing up what is interesting and also providing sympathy, even if in a rather limited sense, the sense of neutral understanding, even if we're not granting approval to people or events. The world, Scott makes clear in Chronicles, is a cornucopia of stories. This is what we do as humans. We make stories as much as we make money or families. Having reintroduced one framing device for his fiction in Chronicles of the Canongate, a narrator, Crystal Croft Angry, Scott then proceeds to pile the framing higher with others. Croft Angry apparently derives his tale of the Highland Widow from an ancient lady, Mrs. Bethune Balliol. Next, Croft Angry slips in the two drovers from his own personal store of Highland lore, rather mysteriously, so that we find ourselves wondering who told Croft Angry this. And he gets the surgeon's daughter from the niece of a friend, Miss Katie Fairscribe. Crystal Croft Angry begins by telling his own tale of how he sets off to regain his estate in Lanarkshire, but eventually abandons that scheme as so much romantic tosh. After which he tells us of the great difficulty he's having in obtaining material for stories, and we go through tea parties and meetings between Croft Angry and Bethune Balliol, who has promised a fascinating Highland tale but never delivers until after her death, when Croft Angry receives her story in the bequest of a manuscript. There's an extended joke upon the reader then as we struggle to get to the start of things, as Scott has us screaming for stories, for the start of the story. The point is that we want stories, we want the curious, we want romance. Scott, in 1827, knew this better than anyone on the planet, and had cause to be rather rueful about the fact. One of the ways in which Walter Scott truly was conservative was in believing that human nature remained essentially unchanging. Material progress might occur, we might move on from more supposedly primitive conditions, but civilization is never complete. History in a sense changes, but we don't. And this is the point about Muriel Spark's nevertheless principle, as she looks at Edinburgh Castle or Crystal Croft Angry, savouring that other volcanic plug, Arthur's Seat. These things poke through the modernity of Scotland's capital, reminding us not so much of inanimate history, but of human nature ready to erupt at any moment. The primitive out there ought to remind us of the primitive which is really in here, in our breast, which never goes away. Robert Louis Stevenson described Scott as a modern and a romantic, meaning in one sense being concerned, as Scott was, with the simultaneous existence of cosmopolitan and selfish mores, of society and savagery. And that is the true way in which Scott is a unifier, or dare I say it, a unionist. Much more important, I would argue, than in any political sense. In the Highland Widow, Bethan Balliol records for Croft Angry how she first encountered the fearsome Highland dame Elspeth MacTavish sitting beside a tree near her hovel. Fierce, stony looking, largely unresponsive, save for a few words. My beautiful, my brave. This is how Elspeth spends all her days over many years until in a sick couch in her cottage, tended by local women when she is dying. But then suddenly she disappears. Perhaps it is speculated in the narrative with her last strength disappearing down some mountain crevice, finally out of sight of the rest of humanity. I should here insert a spoiler alert for this and the other two stories in the Chronicles in case you haven't read them, but many of you will have done. Elspeth has been the wife of Hamish MacTavish, loading his guns for him on the moors against all comers, other clansmen, officers of the law. Hamish has been a cattle rustler, a Jacobite, and many other things beside, until one day, as ever near Hamish's side, Elspeth sees her husband slain by redcoats. Their son, Hamish Bean, grows up with Hamish Senior's skills and daring, with the determination and courage also of his mother. But Hamish Bean refuses to practice outlawry, enlisting instead in the British Army. Horrified, Elspeth drugs her son's whisky so that he misses his point of enlistment. Resigned, Hamish Bean tells his mother, I'll be arrested for desertion, but I'm going to wait here patiently until the detachment come for me. In spite of all Elspeth's urgings, Hamish will not take to the mountains, not go overseas, will not become a freebooter. He has given his word of honour, his Highland word of honour, to enlist, and will not avoid his putative comrades when they come to arrest him. Eventually the detachment of soldiery arrives, and although content to surrender, Hamish has one condition, that he is guaranteed not to be scourged by the Saxons. He will endure firing squad if necessary, but not the lash. The Redcoat Sergeant, a fellow Highlander, and indeed a friend of Hamish's, can proffer no such absolute guarantee, and so is killed by Hamish, who will not surrender without such a promise. Now assured of certain execution, but not the deserter's punishment, Hamish meekly gives up and is taken to Dumbarton Castle, where the firing squad does its work. Here is the Highlander in the first instance progressing, joining the British Army, but there is no happy ending. The project here fails, and Elspeth is left, partly her own just deserts, a terrible, sublime, romantic symbol. So much for romance in the hackneyed, unrealistic sense of the word. Instead, we have romance in the sense of a riot of emotions, of good and bad intentions, of stubborn, warped senses of honour, of the general mess that we humans most frequently make of things. The Two Drovers carries a Shakespearean sense of tragedy. A series of mistakes leads to an awful denouement where one friend kills another and is lawfully executed as a result. Robin Oig McCombich, kin of Rob Roy, and Harry Wakefield, descendant of old English yeomanry, so that both Highlander and Sassenach have their historic, primitive, national sense. These two men are friends. They work harmoniously as cattle drovers until one day on a long drive from Scotland into England, a double-dealing landowner's steward sells both men the same grazing grounds. The resentful pride of Harry means that he refuses to take up the offer to share the grazing when Robin suggests this. They fight, and the Highlander is bested by the Englishman's fists. Humiliated, Robin goes off to retrieve his ski and do, which is in the safekeeping of the Scottish Lowlander Hugh Morrison, and having possession of his weapon, rushes back to stab Harry to death. The nice thing here is that the stereotypes are reversed. Harry is as prideful and obstinate as any Highlander is supposed to be. Robin as thoughtful and as deliberate in his fighting strategy as any level-headed Sassenach is supposed to be. Indeed, acting not in the heat of passion, but having time to consider his actions, Robin is convicted of murder on the basis of malice aforethought. We are told of Robin, he met his fate with great firmness and acknowledged the justice of his sentence, but he repelled indignantly the observations of those who accused him of attacking an unarmed man. I gave a life for the life that I took, he said, and what can I do more? Justice having been served, the reader is left dissatisfied. Two basically good, honest men come to an untimely end through their quarrel, which is as much about emotion or principle as it is about practicality. Robin's dagger has been in Hugh Morrison's safekeeping to begin with, because at the outset of the drove, Robin's aunt, Janet of Tomahurich, has walked the diesel around Robin and prophesied that Saxon blood, paler, less rich than Gaelic blood, will be on his dagger before long. In fact, Robin, had he kept the dagger rather than surrendering it after this prophecy, had he kept the dagger, then Harry likely would not have assaulted him in the first place. Here is Scott's tragicomical puncturing of Highland's second sight. The death of Harry happens not as prophesied by this supernatural Highland ability, but in the attempt to go along with or take account of the Highland second sight. Robin, bilingual, fluent in English as in Gaelic, full of cultural and economic facility as he traverses the cattle markets of Britain, is very much a modern man, adaptable, a creator of wealth, but is caught out by dishonesty and prejudice not his own. Harry at first believes, or wants to believe, that Robin has been double-dealing, has been in league with the dishonest stewards. In the background here is the idea of Highland treachery, untrustworthiness, which Scott is setting up and puncturing. I've heard a very crude reading of the two drovers from a Scottish historian who claims that the text celebrates the demise of the Highlander. Quite the opposite. Scott's story laments that others are unjust to the Highlander, that others might trap the Highlander in a history that is Anglo-centric, Lowland-centric, when those within the Gaeltacht are cosmopolitan, cross-cultural adapters, as Robin tries to be, as Hamish in the Highland Widow attempts to be also. Threat comes from within and without, from human nature all around us. And from the start of his career as a novelist in 1814 in Waverley, Walter Scott had been telling us something similar about the mixed human culture that is everywhere. Fergus McKeever, Vicky and Vore, and many of the Jacobites have their clan allegiances, but they are also Europeans, skilled in foreign policy and language, or languages, practiced in political intrigue, including the dirty political intrigue at the heart of the British Parliament. These are not isolated people beyond the Highland line in any true sense at all. Waverley is sometimes read as dealing with a great hinge or transitional point in British and Scottish history, and so it is up to a point, but it should not be overread, as it sometimes has been, as representing a movement from primitive to civilised society. Rather, it shows a decisive translation of political, ideological, dynastic power. Human nature remains much the same either side of the supposed fault line of 1745. This brings us to the third story in the Chronicles, the Surgeon's Daughter. In search of additional story material, Croftangry is advised by his friend Mr. Fairscribe to send his muse to India As the latter says, you will find as much shooting and stabbing there as ever was in the wild Highlands. The story, though, which he obtains from Fairskribe's niece, begins in a provincial Scottish town, where a country doctor, Gideon Gray, tends to a suddenly pitched up, exotic Portuguese woman who gives birth to a baby son in his house. Her father is hot on her heels, turns up and removes her from the doctor's house, but he refuses to take with him his newborn grandson, although he leaves the infant behind in Gideon's household, providing well for him over the years with generous financial allowance. Richard Middlemas, as the child becomes known, forms an attachment to the doctor's daughter, Minnie, but ambition takes him off to join the East India Company. At first drugged, robbed and hopelessly hospitalised by a double-dealing colleague, Middlemas is rescued by Adam Hartley, previously fellow medical apprentice also in Gideon Gray's house, and also in love with Minnie. But Middlemas goes on in the subcontinent to become a freebooter, the consort of an Indian war baroness with whom he conspires to deliver Minnie into the hands of an Indian warlord who is in love with her, Minnie having come to India to find Middlemas. I won't give the ending away this time, but clearly Middlemas is a wrong-un. We might expect unfortunate start in life, quickly followed by good fortune, indeed great love, from the Gray family and from Hartley, to be met with goodness in return. But this does not happen. Perhaps from a sense of entitlement on Middlemas's part, as scion of a wealthy European family, though if it is entitlement, this is something you can only imagine, since it's largely evaporated before he's more than a few days old, or perhaps because he is simply evil. There's no straightforward cause and effect in human behaviour any more than there is in history in Scott's work. Stuff happens. Chronicles of the Canongate I find to be Scott's most moving work, a heroic work. It pioneers in world fiction the unhappy ending 3 times over, and yet this fact is circumscribed not by melancholy or sadness, but by Croftangry's, aka Sir Walter's, situation, brought low by the circumstances of life, but not bitter, uncomplaining, responding with productivity, with telling stories as a kind of higher comfort, but something more. Stories don't just make sense of things, and sometimes they don't at all. They don't necessarily show us cause and effect. As often as not, they show us the recurrent senselessness of things, the bad human agency which brings us down. Stories too, as I've said, even if they don't always point to a moral or explain things in any particular way, these stories are what we do. Stories, Robert Patterson or Old Mortality, chiselling away at the graves of the Covenanters over 100 years later. The antiquarian endeavours of Jonathan Oldbuck, another of Scott's persona, who features also in Reliquiae Tropcosiensis, the remains of Tropcossey House, one of Scott's very last works. A comical, fictional guide to Abbotsford that he is writing after several strokes in the early 1830s, still working off his debts, at a point much worse even than the insolvency of 1826. Our storyteller, a man of great indefatigability, a man of utter moral responsibility, a man not afraid to face and write about the darkness. There is nothing escapist or insipid about the majority of Walter Scott's fiction. He is a great Scot, a great man of world literature, and anyone who denies any of this is frankly a grudging nincompoop. I give you the immortal memory of Sir Walter Scott.